The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who required my signature and photo ID. As I tore open the thick manila envelope, my hands trembling slightly from my morning coffee, I never could have imagined that the legal documents inside would reveal just how little my sister-in-law actually knew about her own husband's business, or my role in it. The demand was breathtaking in its audacity. Half of all my assets, including my home, my investment accounts, and what she claimed was community property built during her marriage to my brother. What Rachel Morrison didn't realize as she sat in her lawyer's office, plotting to take everything I'd worked for, was that I owned 60% of the orthopedic practice that had made her husband, my brother David, one of the most successful doctors in Phoenix, Arizona. She was about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one holding all the cards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jennifer Hayes, and at 52, I thought I understood the dynamics of my family better than anyone. For 15 years, I had watched my brother David build what appeared to be a thriving medical practice, while his wife Rachel enjoyed the fruits of that success. The sprawling house in Scottsdale, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the elaborate vacations to Europe and the Caribbean that she documented obsessively on social media. What Rachel never knew, what David had never told her, was that none of it would have been possible without me. The story began 18 years ago when David graduated from medical school at Johns Hopkins with crushing debt, over $300,000 in student loans, plus the additional costs of his orthopedic surgery residency and fellowship. He was brilliant, ambitious, and completely broke. Meanwhile, I had spent the previous decade building a successful consulting firm that specialized in healthcare practice management. My company, Hayes Healthcare Solutions, had grown from a one-woman operation run out of my apartment to a thriving business with clients across the Southwest. When David approached me about partnering with him to establish his practice, I saw an opportunity that went beyond simple family loyalty. The orthopedic field in Phoenix was booming, driven by an aging population, active retirees, and a growing number of sports-related injuries from the area's year-round outdoor activities. David had the medical expertise and the charm to build relationships with patients and referring physicians. I had the business acumen, the capital, and the connections to make it happen. We structured the partnership carefully, with the help of a business attorney who specialized in medical practices. I would provide the initial capital, $800,000 from my business and personal savings, to cover equipment, office space, staff salaries, and operating expenses for the first 2 years. In return, I would own 60% of Morrison Orthopedic Associates, while David retained 40%. The arrangement was documented in detailed partnership agreements, corporate filings, and bank records. David's role was to be the face of the practice, the skilled surgeon who would build relationships and establish the medical reputation. My role was everything else: financial management, staffing decisions, strategic planning, marketing, and the complex world of insurance negotiations and healthcare regulations. We agreed that David would receive a substantial salary plus bonuses based on the practice's performance, while I would remain largely behind the scenes. The decision to keep my ownership stake private wasn't initially about deception. It was about practicality. Patients want to believe their doctor owns the practice where they're treated. They want that sense of personal investment and accountability. Having the practice's primary owner be someone who never appeared in the office, who wasn't a medical professional, could undermine patient confidence and physician referrals. David introduced me to colleagues and staff as his business consultant and practice manager, which was technically accurate even if it didn't reveal the full scope of my involvement. When he married Rachel 3 years after the practice opened, he maintained that same narrative. She knew I helped with business stuff, but David never explained the actual ownership structure or my financial investment. At first, I didn't think much of this omission. David and Rachel were newlyweds, focused on building their life together, rather than discussing the intricate details of medical practice ownership. Rachel seemed content with her role as the doctor's wife, planning dinner parties, decorating their new home, and eventually becoming involved in various charitable organizations around Phoenix. As the years passed, however, the casual deception evolved into something more complex. Rachel began to see herself as integral to David's success, often telling people at social gatherings how she had supported him through the early years and helped him build the practice from nothing. She spoke with authority about their business decisions and their financial planning, making it clear she believed herself to be an equal partner in everything David had achieved. David seemed to encourage this narrative, perhaps because it was easier than explaining the truth, or perhaps because he had begun to believe it himself. During family gatherings, he would describe major practice decisions as if he had made them independently, rarely mentioning my role in the strategic planning or financial oversight that had driven our success. Morrison Orthopedic Associates flourished beyond our most optimistic projections. Within 5 years, we had expanded from David's solo practice to a 4-physician group with 2 locations and a specialized surgery center. Our revenue grew from $400,000 in the first year to over $3.2 million annually by year 10. We developed partnerships with local hospitals, established relationships with professional sports teams, and built a reputation for innovative treatments and excellent outcomes. Throughout this growth, I maintained my behind-the-scenes role while expanding my own consulting business. Hayes Healthcare Solutions now managed practices across Arizona, Nevada, and California, providing the expertise that had made David's practice so successful to dozens of other medical professionals. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was becoming known throughout the healthcare industry as one of the most effective practice management consultants in the Southwest, while my own brother's wife remained completely unaware of my role in his success. The financial arrangements we had established served both David and me well. His 40% ownership stake, combined with his substantial salary and performance bonuses, provided him with an annual income that consistently exceeded $450,000. My 60% stake, plus management fees from other consulting clients, had allowed me to build a personal net worth approaching $2.8 million by my 50th birthday. Rachel, meanwhile, had settled into a lifestyle that reflected David's apparent prosperity. She left her job as a marketing coordinator shortly after their marriage, explaining to friends that David's success made it unnecessary for her to work. She threw herself into volunteer activities, became a fixture at charity galas, and developed what she described as her passion for interior design, which seemed to primarily involve expensive renovation projects on their increasingly elaborate homes. The couple moved 3 times during their marriage, each transitioned to a larger, more luxurious property in more exclusive neighborhoods. The house they purchased in Scottsdale 5 years ago, a 4,200 square foot Mediterranean-style home with a pool, spa, and guest house, carried a price tag of $1.1 million. Rachel decorated it with the enthusiasm of someone who believed money was unlimited, filling it with custom furniture, original artwork, and what she proudly described as investment pieces. Their social life revolved around the country club circuit, charity events, and vacations that Rachel documented extensively on Instagram and Facebook. She had cultivated an image as the successful doctor's wife, someone whose opinions on fashion, home design, and social events carried weight among Phoenix's upper-middle-class social circles. During family gatherings, Rachel would often make casual comments about their financial decisions and future plans. She spoke knowledgeably about real estate investments, stock portfolios, and retirement planning, always using pronouns that suggested equal partnership in all financial matters. David rarely corrected these assumptions, and over time I began to realize that he might have actively fostered them. The first sign of trouble in their marriage emerged about 2 years ago, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Rachel began making more frequent comments about David's work schedule, his weekend hospital rounds, and the demands of the practice. What had once been good-natured complaints about being a medical widow took on a sharper edge. "David's always at the office or the hospital," she would say during family dinners at my parents' house. "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to that practice instead of him." She would laugh as she said it, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. David, for his part, seemed increasingly stressed about aspects of the practice that had never bothered him before. He began questioning decisions about staffing, equipment purchases, and office policies, decisions that we had always made collaboratively, but that he now seemed to view as impositions on his autonomy. "Jennifer thinks we should upgrade the imaging equipment," he would tell Rachel, as if I were an outside consultant making recommendations, rather than his business partner making strategic decisions about our jointly owned practice. The subtle shift in language troubled me. but I attributed it to the normal tensions that can develop in any long-term business relationship. The marriage counseling began quietly, something I learned about only when David asked to reschedule several practice meetings due to appointments he couldn't move. When I finally asked directly, he admitted that he and Rachel were working through some communication issues with a therapist. Nothing serious, he assured me, just the usual stuff that comes up after 15 years of marriage. Rachel feels like we don't spend enough time together, and I feel like she doesn't understand the pressures of running a medical practice. I offered support and flexibility with his schedule, never imagining that the quote, communication issues would eventually evolve into Rachel's belief that she was entitled to half of everything I had built. The divorce papers were filed on a Friday afternoon in March. David called me that evening, his voice strained and exhausted. "Rachel's moving out," he said without preamble. "She's filed for divorce, and she's asking for spousal support and half of everything." My first concern was for him, the emotional toll of a failed marriage, the practical challenges of reorganizing his life. It never occurred to me that half of everything might extend beyond David's assets to include claims against mine. That understanding came 3 weeks later, when the certified letter arrived at my office with Rachel's attorney's letterhead and a list of demands that took my breath away. According to the documents, Rachel Morrison, soon to be Rachel Patterson again, believed that 15 years of marriage to a successful doctor entitled her to far more than anyone had imagined. She was claiming that David's practice ownership was community property, which meant she should receive half of its value. But her attorney had apparently done extensive research into Morrison Orthopedic Associates, discovering assets and revenue streams that suggested the practice was worth far more than David's 40% stake alone. The letter detailed Rachel's demands with precision that bordered on vindictiveness. She wanted half of the practice's appraised value, half of all business-related real estate, half of David's investment accounts, ongoing spousal support of $8,000 per month, and, most shockingly, half of what her attorney described as related business assets held by family members who benefited from the marital partnership. That last phrase was where my name appeared in the legal documents for the first time. Rachel's attorney had somehow discovered that I owned a significant stake in David's practice, and they were arguing that my ownership constituted a sham transaction designed to hide community assets from potential divorce proceedings. According to their theory, David and I had colluded to structure the practice ownership in a way that would minimize Rachel's claims in the event of divorce. They were demanding financial records, business documents, and depositions from both David and me to, quote, uncover the true nature of the asset-hiding scheme. The allegations were as insulting as they were legally groundless. The partnership between David and me predated his marriage to Rachel by 3 years, was documented with meticulous legal and financial records, and had been structured by experienced attorneys who specialized in medical practice law. Every transaction, every investment, every major decision had been recorded and reported appropriately to tax authorities and regulatory bodies. But as I read through the legal documents, I realized that Rachel's attorney had crafted their demands with enough sophistication to create months of expensive litigation, even if their ultimate claims were unlikely to succeed. They were betting that the cost and complexity of defending against their allegations would force David and me to agree to a settlement that gave Rachel far more than she was actually entitled to receive. What they hadn't counted on, what Rachel certainly didn't know, was that the woman she was trying to intimidate and financially destroy was the same woman who had built the business empire she was trying to claim as her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after receiving Rachel's legal demands, I sat in my corner office overlooking the Phoenix skyline, surrounded by 18 years of meticulously organized business records. File cabinets lined the walls, containing every contract, every financial statement, every piece of correspondence that documented the true ownership structure of Morrison Orthopedic Associates. The irony wasn't lost on me. The evidence that would destroy Rachel's claims was literally within arm's reach, yet she had no idea it existed. My assistant, Maria Gonzalez, knocked softly on the door before entering with a fresh cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Maria had been with Hayes Healthcare Solutions for 12 years and knew the intricacies of my business relationships better than anyone, including the real dynamics between David and me. "Jennifer, I've been fielding calls all morning. she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. 3 reporters from local business publications, 2 attorneys who somehow heard about the lawsuit, and David's office manager, Sandra, who sounds absolutely panicked. Word is spreading fast about this divorce. I rubbed my temples, already feeling the weight of what was to come. In the healthcare industry, reputation was everything. Medical practices lived and died based on patient trust, physician relationships, and the perception of stability and professionalism. A messy divorce involving asset disputes and allegations of financial manipulation could damage Morrison Orthopedic's reputation in ways that would take years to repair. What exactly is Sandra hearing? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Maria consulted her notes. Apparently, Rachel's attorney has been making calls to other medical practices in Phoenix, asking questions about our consulting contracts, and trying to establish a pattern of what he's calling shell company structures, designed to hide assets. He's also reached out to the Arizona Medical Board, suggesting they investigate potential conflicts of interest in physician-owned practices that use outside management companies. The magnitude of Rachel's attack was becoming clear. This wasn't just about securing a favorable divorce settlement. This was a coordinated campaign designed to destroy both David's medical practice and my consulting business. If she couldn't have half of what she believed was rightfully hers, she seemed determined to ensure that no one would benefit from it. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for Thomas Kellerman, the attorney who had structured our original partnership agreement. Tom had built his career specializing in medical practice law, and over the years he had become not just our legal counsel, but a trusted advisor who understood the complexities of physician-business-owner relationships. Jennifer, Tom's familiar voice carried a note of concern even in his greeting. I was expecting your call. I've already reviewed the documents that Rachel's attorney sent over, and I have to say, they've done their homework. This is going to be more complicated than a typical divorce case. We arranged to meet that afternoon at his downtown office, a glass tower that housed some of Phoenix's most prestigious law firms. As I gathered the financial records I would need, my mind wandered to a conversation I'd had with David just 6 months earlier, a conversation that now seemed ominous in retrospect. We had been reviewing the practice's quarterly financial statements when David made an offhand comment about Rachel's increasing interest in their personal investments. She's been asking a lot of questions about our retirement accounts and the value of the practice, he had said, not looking up from the spreadsheets we were reviewing. I told her we should probably sit down with a financial planner to get everything organized. At the time, I had encouraged the idea, thinking it was smart financial planning for a successful couple approaching their 50s. Now I wondered if Rachel's questions had been reconnaissance for the legal assault she was planning. The drive to Tom's office took me through the heart of Phoenix's medical district, past the hospital where David performed most of his surgeries and the medical office building that housed our original practice location. As I waited at a red light, I noticed a familiar figure walking across the parking lot of the medical plaza. Drive. Richard Chen, one of David's longtime colleagues and a physician whose practice I had consulted with 5 years earlier. Dr. Chen had been instrumental in referring patients to Morrison Orthopedic Associates, particularly complex cases that required David's specialized surgical skills. The professional relationship had evolved into a personal friendship, with Richard and his wife becoming regular members of David and Rachel's social circle. Seeing him now reminded me of another layer of complexity I hadn't yet fully considered: how this legal battle would affect David's professional relationships and the network of referrals that kept our practice thriving. Tom Kellerman's office occupied an entire floor of the downtown tower, with conference rooms that offered panoramic views of the Valley of the Sun. As I was escorted to his private office, I passed associates and paralegals who looked up from their work with the kind of curious glances that suggested they already knew about the high-profile case that had arrived at their firm. Tom greeted me with the warm handshake of an old friend, but his expression was serious as he gestured toward the conference table where copies of Rachel's legal filings were spread out like battle plans. Before we dive into the specifics, he said, I need to understand something that isn't clear from these documents. How much does Rachel actually know about your ownership stake in the practice? It was a question I had been asking myself since receiving the demands. Based on these filings, more than I thought, but less than she thinks she knows, I replied, settling into one of the leather chairs. Her attorney has clearly done research into the practice's corporate structure and discovered that I'm listed as the majority owner, But some of these allegations suggest they don't understand the timeline or the legitimate business reasons for the ownership arrangement. Tom nodded, making notes as I spoke. That's actually good news from a legal standpoint. If they're operating with incomplete information, they're likely to make strategic mistakes that we can exploit. But it also means they might escalate their tactics if they realize how much they don't know. He pulled out a thick folder containing copies of all the original partnership documents, corporate filings, and financial records that established the legitimate business relationship between David and me. The foundation of their case seems to be the argument that your ownership stake represents hidden marital assets, he explained. They're claiming that David used you as a front to conceal community property that should be divided in the divorce. The legal theory was creative but fundamentally flawed, based on a misunderstanding of both the timeline and the business realities of medical practice ownership. The partnership predates the marriage, I pointed out. We have documentation showing that I provided the initial capital, that I've been actively involved in management decisions, and that the ownership percentages reflect actual business contributions rather than any attempt to hide assets. Absolutely, Tom agreed. But proving that in court will require us to disclose financial information that David might not want Rachel to see. Your personal investment history, the profitability of the practice, the details of management agreements between your consulting firm and Morrison Orthopedic. All of that becomes discoverable once we start defending against these claims. The implications of that discovery process were staggering. Not only would Rachel learn the true extent of the business empire her husband had been part of, but the legal proceedings would create a public record that could be accessed by competitors, patients, and anyone else interested in understanding the financial dynamics of our practices. As we reviewed the specific demands in Rachel's filing, a pattern emerged that suggested her attorney had been fishing for information without fully understanding what they had found. They were demanding, quote, 50% of all business assets held jointly or severally by David Morrison and Jennifer Hayes. But the language was broad enough to potentially include assets that had no connection to David's marriage or Rachel's contributions. They're essentially claiming that your entire consulting business is somehow marital property, Tom observed, highlighting specific passages in the legal documents. The theory seems to be that since Morrison Orthopedic was your first major client, and since that relationship grew during David's marriage, Rachel is entitled to half of everything that resulted from it. The absurdity of that argument was breathtaking. By the same logic, any business relationship that existed during a marriage could be claimed as community property by a divorcing spouse. It was a theory that, if successful, would revolutionize divorce law and create chaos for business partnerships across the country. But as Tom explained the likely trajectory of the legal proceedings, I realized that the validity of Rachel's claims was less important than the damage they could cause while being litigated. Even if we ultimately win on every major point, he warned, the process of getting there will be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially devastating to both practices. Discovery alone could take 6 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. We spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive defense strategy that would protect both my assets and David's practice, while minimizing the collateral damage to our professional reputations. The plan required careful coordination between multiple attorneys, forensic accountants, and business valuation experts who could document the legitimate foundations of our partnership. As the meeting concluded, Tom handed me a business card for a private investigator who specialized in divorce cases involving complex business assets. I'm not suggesting we do anything improper, he clarified, but it might be helpful to understand what information Rachel's team is working with and how they obtained it. The speed and specificity of their research suggests they had help from someone with inside knowledge. The possibility that someone within our professional circle was providing information to Rachel's attorneys added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. As I drove back to my office, I mentally reviewed the list of people who had access to detailed information about the practice's ownership structure and financial performance. The list was shorter than I had expected. Besides David and me, only a handful of people knew the complete picture. Tom Kellerman and his legal team, our accountant Richard Barnes, Sandra Morrison, David's office manager and no relation despite the shared surname, and Maria Gonzalez. Each of these individuals had signed confidentiality agreements, and had professional reasons to protect the information they possessed. But there were other sources of information that a determined attorney could access. Corporate filings were public records, though they required some expertise to interpret correctly. Banking relationships could be traced through subpoenas and financial investigations. Professional relationships within the Phoenix medical community could provide insights into the unusual dynamics of our partnership. Back at my office, I found Maria fielding another round of phone calls from reporters, attorneys, and colleagues who had heard rumors about the lawsuit. The Phoenix business community was small enough that news of a high-profile divorce involving asset disputes and medical practices traveled quickly through professional networks. Dr. Chen called, Maria reported as I settled back into my office. He said he's been getting calls from Rachel's attorney asking about referral relationships and financial arrangements between practices. He wanted to give you a heads up that they're casting a wide net. The systematic nature of Rachel's legal team's research was becoming clear. They weren't just examining the direct relationship between David and me. They were mapping the entire ecosystem of professional and financial relationships that surrounded Morrison Orthopedic Associates. It was a thorough approach that demonstrated both the resources they were willing to commit to the case and their determination to find any angle that might support their claims. As the afternoon wore on, I received calls from 3 other physicians whose practices I consulted with, all reporting similar inquiries from Rachel's legal team. The pattern suggested a coordinated investigation designed to establish that my consulting business was somehow improperly intertwined with David's medical practice in ways that should be considered marital assets. The irony was that the very success of my legitimate business relationships was being used as evidence of impropriety. The fact that Morrison Orthopedic had been so successful, and that success had led to consulting contracts with other practices, was being portrayed as a suspicious pattern rather than the natural result of professional competence and business acumen. By evening, I had made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of this legal battle. Instead of simply defending against Rachel's claims, I was going to take control of the narrative by revealing information that would shift the entire dynamic of the divorce proceedings. Rachel Morrison wanted half of everything she thought belonged to her husband. She was about to discover that the woman she was attacking controlled far more of her comfortable lifestyle than she had ever imagined. The time for staying in the background was over. Tomorrow, I would begin showing everyone exactly who owned what in this tangled web of medical practices, consulting contracts, and financial relationships. And Rachel Morrison was going to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who's been holding all the cards from the very beginning. The private investigator Tom Kellerman had recommended turned out to be a former FBI agent named Catherine Wells, a woman in her mid-40s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen enough human deception to recognize it instantly. We met at a coffee shop in Tempe, far enough from downtown Phoenix to avoid the professional circles where both Rachel and I were known. "Before we discuss what I can do for you," Catherine said, stirring her black coffee with methodical precision, "I need to understand what you're really looking for. Are you trying to find ammunition against your sister-in-law, or are you trying to protect yourself from something you suspect is coming?" The distinction was important, and Catherine's question forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly than I had been willing to do. "I need to understand how Rachel's legal team obtained such detailed information about my business relationship so quickly," I replied. "The level of specificity in their filings suggests either extensive research capabilities or inside information." Catherine nodded, making notes in a small leather notebook. Divorce attorneys in high-asset cases often hire forensic investigators who specialize in uncovering hidden assets. But you're right that the speed suggests they had a head start. "Tell me about the people who have access to your business information." Over the next hour, I provided Catherine with a comprehensive overview of the professional relationships surrounding Morrison Orthopedic Associates and Hayes Healthcare Solutions. The list of people with detailed knowledge was surprisingly extensive when I really thought about it. Not just the obvious players like Tom Kellerman and our accountant, but also bank officers, insurance representatives, medical equipment vendors, and the dozens of staff members across multiple practices who handled billing, scheduling, and administrative functions. "The weak link is rarely the person you suspect," Catherine observed as I finished my summary. "It's usually someone peripheral who has access to information but doesn't understand its significance. A bookkeeper who talks too freely at a social gathering. A bank employee who recognizes names on account documents. a staff member who overhears conversations and shares them innocently. She agreed to conduct a discreet investigation into how Rachel's legal team had assembled their information, with the understanding that anything she discovered would be used purely for defensive purposes. "I'm not in the business of creating problems," she clarified. "I'm in the business of understanding them so my clients can make informed decisions." As I drove back to my office, Catherine's words echoed in my mind. The phrase "informed decisions" resonated because I realized I had been operating with incomplete information about my own situation. While I knew the legal and financial structures of my businesses better than anyone, I had never truly understood how vulnerable those structures might be to attack from unexpected directions. That afternoon brought a development that crystallized my concerns. Sandra Morrison, David's office manager, called with news that made my stomach drop. "Jennifer, I thought you should know that we received a formal request for all employment records, financial documents, and correspondence related to Hayes Healthcare Solutions going back 5 years, she said, her voice tight with stress. It came from Rachel's attorney with a court order attached. The scope of the discovery request was breathtaking. 5 years of records would include not just the consulting agreements between my firm and David's practice, but also detailed financial information about my other clients, strategic planning documents, and confidential communications about practice management strategies. "What exactly are they asking for?" I asked, already mentally cataloging the sensitive information contained in 5 years of business correspondence. Sandra read from the legal document. "All contracts, amendments, and communications related to business consulting services provided by Hayes Healthcare Solutions to Morrison Orthopedic Associates. All financial records showing payments, fees, commissions, or other compensation. All documents related to strategic planning, practice management, or business development activities. All employment records for Jennifer Hayes or Hayes Healthcare Solutions staff members who provided services to Morrison Orthopedic Associates." The request was fishing expedition of epic proportions, designed to find any detail that might support Rachel's claim that my consulting business was somehow an extension of David's practice, rather than a legitimate independent operation. But it also revealed something important about their legal strategy. They were looking for evidence of what they believed was an improper business relationship, which meant they didn't fully understand the actual ownership structure. I called Tom Kellerman immediately to discuss our options for challenging the discovery request. "We can fight it," he said after reviewing the court order, "but that might actually draw more attention to information we'd prefer to keep private. Sometimes the better strategy is controlled disclosure. Give them what they're asking for in a way that tells the story we want them to hear." The concept of controlled disclosure was intriguing. Instead of hiding information that would eventually come to light anyway, we could present it in a context that supported our position and undermined Rachel's claims. "What would that look like practically?" I asked. "We provide comprehensive documentation of your legitimate business relationship with David's practice," Tom explained. "Every contract, every payment, every strategic decision, but we present it in a way that demonstrates the arm's-length nature of your professional relationship and the substantial value you've provided in exchange for your ownership stake." It was a risky strategy that would require careful preparation and complete transparency about aspects of my business that I had never expected to become public. But it had the advantage of allowing us to control the narrative rather than simply reacting to Rachel's accusations. That evening, I worked late in my office, preparing for what I knew would be weeks of intensive document review and strategic planning. As I organized files and made lists of the materials we would need to gather, my phone rang with a call from an unexpected source. My sister-in-law's mother, Patricia Patterson. "Jennifer, I hope you don't mind me calling," Patricia said, her voice carrying the carefully modulated tone of someone trying to navigate a delicate social situation. "I wanted you to know that I don't support what Rachel is doing, and I'm concerned about how this is affecting David." Patricia had always been a voice of reason in family gatherings, a retired school principal who seemed to see through social pretenses and family dynamics with unusual clarity. Her call suggested that Rachel's legal assault was creating divisions even within her own support network. "I appreciate you reaching out," I replied carefully, unsure how much I should reveal about my own situation. "This has been difficult for everyone involved." Rachel has always had a tendency toward entitlement, Patricia continued, with the bluntness of someone who had observed her daughter's character development over 4 decades. When she was growing up, she believed that wanting something was the same as deserving it. I had hoped marriage would temper that impulse, but I'm afraid success has actually made it worse. The conversation provided insights into Rachel's psychology that helped explain the aggressive nature of her legal demands. This wasn't just about securing financial security after divorce. It was about claiming what she believed she had earned through 15 years of being married to a successful doctor. "Is there anything I should know about Rachel's plans?" I asked, hoping Patricia might have information about her daughter's strategy or timeline. Patricia was quiet for a moment before responding. "She's been talking about this divorce for almost 2 years, Jennifer. She's been planning and preparing for much longer than anyone realizes. I think she's always resented that David's success came from something she couldn't control or understand." That revelation added another dimension to my understanding of the situation. If Rachel had been planning this divorce for 2 years, it meant her recent questions about finances and her growing interest in David's business relationships hadn't been casual curiosity. They had been systematic intelligence gathering for a legal battle she was already planning. After ending the call with Patricia, I sat in my darkened office looking out at the Phoenix skyline and processing the implications of what I had learned. Rachel's legal assault wasn't an impulsive reaction to a failed marriage. It was a calculated campaign that had been in development for years. The next morning brought news that confirmed my worst fears about the scope of Rachel's investigation. Catherine Wells called with preliminary findings from her research into how Rachel's legal team had assembled their information so quickly. "They hired a forensic accounting firm 6 months ago," Catherine reported. "I've confirmed that Riverside Forensic Solutions has been conducting a comprehensive investigation into your business relationships, David's practice finances, and the professional network surrounding both of you since last October." The timeline was devastating. 6 months of professional investigation meant that Rachel's legal team had access to information I was only beginning to understand they possessed. They had used sophisticated research techniques to map the financial relationships between my consulting business and David's practice, identify other physicians who might have relevant information, and probably develop a detailed understanding of the healthcare practice management industry in Phoenix. "There's more," Catherine continued. "Riverside Forensic has also been investigating your personal finances, property holdings, and investment accounts. They've built a comprehensive profile of your assets and income sources that probably exceeds what most people know about their own financial situations." The violation felt personal and professional simultaneously. My privacy had been systematically destroyed by people who had no legitimate right to access that information, all in service of a legal theory that I was somehow hiding assets that belonged to Rachel. But Catherine's final piece of information was the most disturbing. "They've also been investigating your other consulting clients, trying to establish a pattern of what they're calling, quote, physician practice manipulation for asset concealment. If they can prove that your business model is somehow fraudulent or designed to hide assets, they might be able to make claims against not just Morrison Orthopedic, but your entire consulting business." The magnitude of the threat was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about Rachel trying to claim half of what she thought was David's practice. It was about destroying my entire professional life by portraying my legitimate business relationships as an elaborate scheme to hide marital assets. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Rachel Morrison had made a fundamental miscalculation. She had assumed that her systematic investigation would reveal vulnerabilities and secrets that she could exploit for maximum financial gain. Instead, her research was about to reveal the true scope of the business empire she was attacking, and just how little power she actually had in this fight. It was time to show Rachel Morrison exactly who she was dealing with. But first, I needed to gather my own intelligence about her situation, her resources, and her vulnerabilities. If she wanted to play this game at a professional level, I was prepared to show her what that actually looked like. Armed with Catherine Wells' findings about Rachel's extensive preparation, I decided it was time to conduct my own investigation into the woman who was trying to destroy my life's work. If Rachel had spent 6 months building a profile of my assets and business relationships, I needed to understand her financial situation, her resources, and most importantly, her vulnerabilities. The first step was understanding exactly how Rachel was funding this elaborate legal assault. High-end forensic accounting firms like Riverside Forensic Solutions didn't come cheap. Their services typically cost between $300 and $500 per hour, and a 6-month investigation could easily run into 6 figures. Divorce attorneys, with the expertise to handle complex business asset cases, charged similar rates. Rachel was looking at legal costs that could exceed $200,000 before the case even went to trial. I asked Catherine to trace Rachel's funding sources, a request that led to some surprising discoveries about my sister-in-law's financial independence. She's not just living off David's income, Catherine reported during our meeting the following week. Rachel Patterson has been building her own asset base for years, and she's been much more strategic about it than anyone realized. The details were illuminating and somewhat admirable, despite my personal feelings about Rachel's current actions. Over the 15 years of her marriage, she had systematically converted what she called her household allowance into investment accounts held in her maiden name. Starting with modest amounts in the early years of the marriage, she had built a portfolio worth approximately $380,000 by the time she filed for divorce. She's also inherited money from her grandmother's estate 3 years ago, Catherine continued, consulting her notes. About $150,000 that she invested in real estate and stock funds. And she's been working as a freelance interior design consultant for the past 5 years, generating income that she's kept separate from the marital finances. This information reframed my understanding of Rachel's motivations. She wasn't just a dependent spouse looking for financial security after divorce. She was a woman with significant assets of her own who believed she was entitled to even more. Her legal assault on my business wasn't driven by desperation. It was driven by what she saw as a business opportunity to multiply her existing wealth. But Catherine's most important discovery involved Rachel's choice of legal representation. Her attorney, Michael Brennan, specializes in high-asset divorce cases where one spouse owns a business, she explained. He's built his reputation on aggressive discovery tactics and claims that business partnerships are often used to hide marital assets. 3 of his recent cases involved situations remarkably similar to yours. The pattern was concerning. Brennan had apparently developed a template for attacking business partnerships in divorce proceedings, using forensic investigation and broad discovery requests to pressure defendants into settlements rather than face expensive litigation. His strategy relied on the fact that most business owners would prefer to pay a substantial settlement rather than risk having their business relationships examined in public court proceedings. There's something else you should know about Brennan's recent cases, Catherine added with a knowing look. In 2 of the 3 similar situations, the business partnerships he attacked turned out to be completely legitimate, but his clients still received substantial settlements because the defendants wanted to avoid the publicity and legal costs of a protracted fight. The implication was clear. Rachel and her attorney were betting that I would follow the same pattern, agreeing to a settlement that gave her far more than she was entitled to, rather than defending against their claims in court. They had calculated that the reputational damage and legal costs of fighting back would make surrender the rational choice. It was a strategy that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of business psychology and legal leverage. Unfortunately for Rachel, it was based on the assumption that I was a typical business owner who would prioritize short-term peace over long-term principle. She was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. My next step was to examine Rachel's public statements and social media presence, looking for evidence that might contradict her claims about the marriage and her contributions to David's success. What I found was a treasure trove of information that painted a very different picture than the one her legal filings presented. Rachel's Instagram account, which she had maintained meticulously throughout her marriage, told a story of leisure and luxury rather than sacrifice and contribution. Photo after photo showed her at charity lunches, vacation destinations, spa retreats, and social events, often during times when David was working long hours at the hospital or dealing with practice emergencies. More importantly, her captions and comments revealed her attitude toward David's work in ways that directly contradicted her legal claims. In one post from 2 years ago, she had written, "Another weekend alone while David plays doctor." Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be married to someone with a normal job who actually comes home at night. Another post from just 8 months ago showed her at a luxury resort in Sedona with the caption, "Girls' Weekend because my husband thinks his patients are more important than his wife. At least his success pays for nice consolation prizes." The pattern of comments suggested someone who viewed David's medical practice as an inconvenience rather than a shared enterprise she had helped build. Her public statements portrayed her as someone who tolerated David's career for the lifestyle it provided, not as a partner who had contributed to his professional success. But the most damaging evidence came from her interactions with friends who commented on her posts. When a friend had asked about David's long hours, Rachel had responded, "I stopped trying to understand his business years ago. As long as the check's clear and I can live my life, I don't really care about the details." These social media posts would be admissible evidence in divorce proceedings, and they directly undermined her claims that she had been an active participant in building David's practice. Instead, they showed someone who had deliberately distanced herself from her husband's professional life, while enjoying the financial benefits it provided. Armed with this information, I scheduled a meeting with David to discuss strategy and coordination. We met at a restaurant in Scottsdale, far from the medical district where we might encounter colleagues or patients. David looked exhausted, the stress of the divorce proceedings clearly taking a toll on both his personal life and his professional performance. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said as we settled into a corner booth away from other diners. "I thought we could handle the divorce quietly, split everything fairly, and move on with our lives. I had no idea Rachel was planning this kind of attack on you." His genuine distress was evident, but I needed to understand how much he knew about Rachel's broader legal strategy. "David, did you know that Rachel hired forensic accountants 6 months ago? That she's been investigating not just our practice but my entire consulting business?" The shock on his face was genuine. 6 months ago? We were still in marriage counseling 6 months ago. She was talking about working things out, maybe taking a vacation together to reconnect. He paused, processing the timeline. "You're telling me she was planning this legal assault while sitting in therapy sessions talking about saving our marriage?" The revelation seemed to hit him harder than I had expected. Whatever David had believed about his marriage and Rachel's motivations, the reality of her calculated deception was clearly devastating. "I feel like I never really knew her at all," he said quietly. I shared Catherine's findings about Rachel's independent assets and her attorney's track record, watching David's expression shift from hurt to anger to something approaching determination. "She's not just trying to take half of what I have," he said finally. "She's trying to destroy both of our careers based on lies about our business relationship." "That's exactly right," I confirmed. "And that's why we need to coordinate our response carefully. Her legal strategy depends on us being defensive and reactive. We need to take control of the narrative and show everyone exactly what the real situation is." David leaned forward, his medical training evident. In the systematic way he began thinking through the problem. "What do you need from me? How do we fight back effectively?" I had been thinking about this question since my conversation with Tom Kellerman about controlled disclosure. "We're going to give Rachel and her attorney exactly what they're asking for, but we're going to do it in a way that tells our story instead of theirs. We're going to document every aspect of our legitimate business relationship so thoroughly that their claims will look not just wrong, but ridiculous." The plan I outlined was ambitious and would require significant coordination between multiple professionals. We would engage our own forensic accountants to prepare a comprehensive analysis of the practice's finances and ownership structure. We would document the value I had contributed to Morrison Orthopedic Associates through detailed case studies and client testimonials. We would prepare depositions from other physicians who could testify about the legitimate nature of my consulting services. Most importantly, we would present evidence of Rachel's own statements and actions that contradicted her claims about contributing to David's success. Her social media posts, her public comments about his career, and her deliberate disengagement from his professional life would all become part of the public record. "There's one more thing," I told David as our meeting concluded. "I want you to think carefully about whether you're prepared for Rachel to learn exactly how successful our partnership has been. Once we start this process, she's going to discover financial information that might be much larger than what she's currently claiming." David's response surprised me with its firmness. "Jennifer, you saved my career and made it possible for me to become the surgeon I always wanted to be. If Rachel wants to attack that partnership, she's going to learn exactly what she's been living off of for 15 years. I'm ready for her to know the truth." As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of clarity about the path forward that I hadn't experienced since receiving Rachel's initial demands. We were done being defensive, done letting her control the timeline and the narrative. Rachel Morrison wanted to play hardball with people she thought she understood. She was about to discover that the woman she had been underestimating for 15 years was finally ready to show her exactly what she was capable of achieving. The war room we established in Tom Kellerman's conference suite looked like something from a corporate merger rather than a divorce proceeding. 3 walls were covered with whiteboards displaying timelines, financial charts, and relationship diagrams that mapped out 18 years of legitimate business transactions. The 4th wall held enlarged copies of Rachel's social media posts, her public statements, and excerpts from her legal filings, a stark visual contrast between her claims and her documented behavior. Our team had grown to include forensic accountant Rebecca Torres, business valuation expert Dr. Alan Westbrook, and media consultant James Liu. Each brought specialized expertise that would be crucial in dismantling Rachel's narrative while building our own compelling story of legitimate business success. Before we discuss tactics, Tom began as our strategy session commenced. I need everyone to understand the broader implications of this case. Rachel's attorney isn't just attacking Jennifer's ownership stake in Morrison Orthopedic. He's attempting to establish legal precedent that could fundamentally change how business partnerships are treated in divorce proceedings throughout Arizona. The weight of that statement settled over the room. If Michael Brennan succeeded in convincing a court that my majority ownership in David's practice constituted hidden marital assets, it would create a template for attacking any business partnership where one partner happened to be married. The ramifications would extend far beyond our personal situation to affect countless entrepreneurs, professionals, and business owners across the state. Rebecca Torres spread out financial statements and corporate documents across the conference table. I've completed a comprehensive analysis of every transaction between Hayes Healthcare Solutions and Morrison Orthopedic Associates since the practice's inception, she announced. What emerges is a clear picture of arm's-length business dealings that generated substantial value for both parties. Her analysis was exhaustive and compelling. Over 18 years, my consulting firm had received approximately $2.1 million in fees from David's practice, payments that were fully documented, properly reported to tax authorities, and completely consistent with industry standards for practice management services. More importantly, the value I had created for the practice far exceeded those fees. Under Jennifer's management, Morrison Orthopedic's revenue grew from $400,000 in year 1 to $3.2 million annually by year 15, Rebecca continued. The practice's profit margins increased from 12% to 28%, well above industry averages. Patient satisfaction scores consistently ranked in the top 5% nationally, and physician referrals increased by 340% over the partnership period. Dr. Westbrook, whose firm specialized in valuing medical practices for mergers and acquisitions, had prepared an independent assessment of Morrison Orthopedic Associates. Based on comparable sales and standard industry metrics, he reported, the practice's current fair market value is approximately $4.8 million. Jennifer's 60% ownership stake represents $2.8 million in legitimate business assets. The numbers were staggering, even to me. While I had always known our partnership was successful, seeing the valuation presented in formal business terms crystallized just how much wealth we had created together. It also explained why Rachel's legal team was so determined to characterize my ownership as hidden marital assets. If they succeeded, she would be claiming rights to nearly $1.5 million in practice value alone. But Dr. Westbrook's analysis included another finding that would prove crucial to our defense strategy. The practice's success metrics, revenue growth, profit margins, patient outcomes, referral patterns, all correlate directly with periods of intensive management intervention by Hayes Healthcare Solutions, he explained. This isn't a passive investment that happened to appreciate in value. It's an actively managed business relationship that created value through professional expertise and strategic direction. James Liu, our media consultant, had been monitoring news coverage and professional gossip about the case throughout the Phoenix medical community. The story is already being framed as a classic divorce battle between a greedy ex-wife and a successful doctor, he reported. But there's growing interest in the business angle, particularly among practice management professionals who understand the implications for their own consulting relationships. His recommendation was to proactively shape the narrative by highlighting the legitimate business aspects of our partnership, while contrasting them with Rachel's documented disengagement from David's professional life. We want the story to be about entrepreneurship and business success, not family drama and asset disputes, he explained. The strategy we developed over the next several hours was both comprehensive and bold. Instead of simply responding to Rachel's demands, we would present a complete picture of the business empire she was attacking, including information that would shock her with its scope and sophistication. Phase 1 involved filing our own legal motions requesting comprehensive financial disclosure from Rachel, including her independent assets, inheritance records, and income from her freelance design work. If she wanted to examine every detail of my business relationships, we would return the favor by scrutinizing her claims of financial dependence and contributions to the marriage. Phase 2 would present detailed documentation of the value creation that justified my ownership stake in Morrison Orthopedic Associates. We would submit expert testimony, client testimonials, and case studies demonstrating the direct correlation between my management strategies and the practice's success. This evidence would make it impossible for Rachel's team to characterize my ownership as anything other than legitimate business investment. Phase 3 was the most ambitious. We would reveal the full scope of Hayes Healthcare Solutions' client base and revenue streams, demonstrating that Morrison Orthopedic represented only a small fraction of my overall business empire. This disclosure would shatter Rachel's narrative about my supposed financial dependence on David's practice, while highlighting her complete ignorance of the business relationships that had funded her lifestyle. There's one more element we should consider, Tom suggested as our planning session concluded. Rachel's attorney has been very aggressive about painting Jennifer as someone who used family relationships to gain unfair business advantages. We should be prepared to demonstrate that Jennifer's success extends far beyond her relationship with David. He was right. My consulting firm's client roster included practices across 4 states, with annual revenues exceeding $1.8 million from sources completely unrelated to David's practice. Professional organizations had recognized my expertise with awards and speaking opportunities. Industry publications had featured my strategic frameworks and case studies. The portrait that would emerge from comprehensive disclosure would be of a successful entrepreneur who happened to be David's sister, not a family member who had leveraged personal relationships for business gain. The following morning, I implemented the first phase of our counteroffensive by calling an emergency meeting with the partners and senior staff of Morrison Orthopedic Associates. It was time to brief the team on the legal challenges we were facing and ensure everyone understood their role in protecting the practice's reputation and operations. The conference room at our main location was packed with physicians, nurse practitioners, office managers, and senior administrative staff. 23 people whose livelihoods depended on the practice's continued success. As I looked around the table at faces I had worked with for years, some since the practice's earliest days, I felt the weight of responsibility for their professional security. I'm sure you've all heard rumors about Dr. Morrison's divorce and potential effects on the practice, I began. I want you to hear the facts directly from me so you can respond appropriately to questions from patients, colleagues, or anyone else who might approach you. I provided a clear, factual summary of Rachel's legal claims and our response strategy, emphasizing that the practice's operations would continue normally regardless of the divorce proceedings. More importantly, I wanted the team to understand that their jobs were secure and that the practice's growth trajectory would not be affected by David's personal situation. Some of you may be contacted by attorneys or investigators working for Mrs. Morrison, I continued. You are under no obligation to speak with them, and I strongly recommend that you refer any such contacts to our legal counsel. If you do choose to speak with them, please remember that your professional obligation is to protect patient confidentiality and practice proprietary information. The questions that followed revealed how well our team understood the business dynamics that Rachel's legal team was apparently struggling to comprehend. Sandra Morrison, the office manager, asked about potential changes to our strategic planning process. Dr. Emily Chen, one of our newer partners, wanted to understand how the legal proceedings might affect our expansion plans for a 3rd location. Most telling was a question from Marcus Williams, our senior physician assistant, who had been with the practice for 8 years. Jennifer, will this change your involvement in the practice's management? Because honestly, you're the reason most of us enjoy working here. The way you've structured our operations, our benefits, our growth opportunities, That's not something we want to lose." His comment sparked a chorus of agreement from around the table. These were healthcare professionals who had worked in other practices before joining Morrison Orthopedic Associates, and they understood the difference between good management and great management. Their loyalty wasn't to David as a physician. It was to the comprehensive practice environment that our partnership had created. As the meeting concluded, I realized that Rachel's legal assault had inadvertently revealed something important about the value I had created over 18 years. The team's reaction demonstrated that my role in the practice's success wasn't just financial, it was operational, strategic, and cultural. I hadn't just invested money in David's medical career. I had built a healthcare organization that functioned at a level that attracted and retained exceptional professionals. That afternoon brought news that confirmed the wisdom of our proactive strategy. Catherine Wells called with an update on Rachel's legal team's activities that suggested they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had undertaken. "Brennan's office has been making calls to business valuation firms," she reported. "They're apparently trying to get a second opinion on the practice's worth, which suggests their initial research underestimated its value. They've also reached out to several of your other consulting clients, trying to establish patterns in your business relationships." The fact that they were scrambling to obtain additional valuations indicated that our disclosure strategy was already having an effect. Rachel's team had apparently assumed they were attacking a small family business worth perhaps $1 to $2 million. They were beginning to discover that they had declared war on a sophisticated business empire worth far more than they had imagined. "There's something else," Catherine continued. "I have a source who suggests that Brennan is advising Rachel to consider settlement negotiations. The scope of discovery they're facing is apparently much larger than they anticipated, and the costs are mounting quickly." For the first time since receiving Rachel's initial demands, I allowed myself to feel a moment of satisfaction. The woman who had thought she could intimidate me into surrendering half my assets was discovering that I was not the easy target she had assumed. Rachel Morrison was about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who's been building an empire while you weren't paying attention. The deposition took place in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Phoenix's financial district, with panoramic views of the Valley of the Sun stretching to the distant mountains. Rachel sat across from me at the polished mahogany table, flanked by Michael Brennan and 2 associates from his firm. For the first time since this legal battle began, we were face to face, and I could see the carefully controlled mask of confidence she wore, barely concealing something that looked remarkably like fear. "Mrs. Hayes," Brennan began, consulting his thick folder of prepared questions, "please state for the record your relationship to Dr. David Morrison and Morrison Orthopedic Associates." It was a routine question designed to establish basic facts, but I had prepared for this moment for weeks. My answer would set the tone for everything that followed, and I intended to make it clear from the outset that Rachel's legal team had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. "I am the majority owner and managing partner of Morrison Orthopedic Associates," I replied, my voice steady and professional. "I own 60% of the practice, which I co-founded with Dr. Morrison 18 years ago, using capital from my healthcare consulting business, Hayes Healthcare Solutions." The statement was factually accurate but deliberately comprehensive, establishing my primary role in the practice's ownership and management, rather than allowing Brennan to frame me as David's sister who happened to have some business involvement. The distinction was crucial for everything that would follow. "And what is the nature of your business relationship with Dr. Morrison?" Brennan continued, following his scripted approach. "Dr. Morrison is my business partner and the minority shareholder in our joint practice," I answered. "He is also my younger brother, but our business relationship is completely separate from our family relationship and predates his marriage to your client by 3 years." I watched Rachel's expression tighten as the financial dynamics she had never understood were laid out with clinical precision. For 15 years, she had assumed that David owned the practice that funded their lifestyle. She was learning in real time that her husband was actually the junior partner in a business controlled by the woman she was trying to destroy financially. Brennan's questioning continued methodically through the standard topics: the formation of the partnership, the capital contributions, the management structure. But I could see him beginning to realize that the case he had prepared was based on incomplete information. Every answer I provided revealed another layer of business sophistication that undermined his client's claims. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it true that your consulting firm receives substantial fees from Morrison Orthopedic Associates?" he asked, attempting to suggest some kind of impropriety in our fee structure. "Hayes Healthcare Solutions charges Morrison Orthopedic the same rates we charge all our clients," I replied. "Our fees are calculated as a percentage of the practice's revenue growth and efficiency improvements, which aligns our interests with our clients' success. This is standard practice in healthcare consulting and results in fees that are typically 40 to 60% below what practices pay for comparable services from larger consulting firms." The answer highlighted something Brennan apparently hadn't anticipated. My consulting fees were actually below market rates, not above them. The financial arrangement between our companies favored David's practice, not mine, a fact that completely undermined any suggestion that I was somehow exploiting our family relationship for business gain. But the real revelation came when Brennan asked about Hayes Healthcare Solutions' other clients and revenue sources. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to reveal the full scope of the business empire that Rachel was attacking. Hayes Healthcare Solutions currently manages consulting relationships with 43 medical practices across Arizona, Nevada, California, and Colorado, I began, watching Rachel's eyes widen as she processed the numbers. Our annual revenue last year was $1.8 million, with Morrison Orthopedic representing approximately 18% of our total client base. The mathematics were devastating to Rachel's legal theory. If Morrison Orthopedic was less than 1/5 of my consulting business's revenue, it was impossible to argue that my success depended on my family relationship with David. Instead, the numbers proved that I was a successful healthcare entrepreneur who happened to have her brother as one of many clients. Furthermore, I continued, Hayes Healthcare Solutions has been recognized as one of the fastest-growing healthcare consulting firms in the Southwest for 3 consecutive years. I've been invited to speak at national conferences, my strategic frameworks have been published in industry journals, and I currently serve on the advisory board of the American Association of Healthcare Practice Management. Each credential I listed further demolished the narrative that Rachel's team had constructed. They had prepared to attack a family member who was hiding assets behind illegitimate business arrangements. Instead, they were confronting a recognized industry expert whose success was documented, published, and acknowledged by professional organizations across the country. Rachel leaned forward to whisper something to Brennan, her composure finally beginning to crack. I couldn't hear what she said, but his expression suggested she was urging him to ask more aggressive questions. When he resumed his questioning, his tone had shifted from routine discovery to something approaching desperation. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it convenient that your so-called consulting business allows you to extract profits from Dr. Morrison's medical practice without your sister-in-law's knowledge or consent?" The question was argumentative and revealed the weakness of their position, but it also gave me the opportunity to deliver the most damaging blow to their case. Tom Kellerman had prepared me for this moment, and I was ready. "Mr. Brennan, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the financial dynamics of our family," I replied calmly. "My consulting business doesn't extract profits from David's practice. It subsidizes them. Morrison Orthopedic's success has been built on below-market consulting fees, favorable equipment financing through my vendor relationships, and strategic guidance that has allowed the practice to grow at rates that far exceed industry averages." I paused to let that information sink in before delivering the final revelation. If Hayes Healthcare Solutions charged Morrison Orthopedic the same rates we charge our other clients, their annual consulting fees would increase by approximately $340,000 per year. Your client has been benefiting from a family discount that has saved her household more than $2 million over the course of her marriage. The silence that followed was absolute. Rachel stared at me with an expression of shock that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the true financial dynamics of her marriage. She hadn't been married to a successful doctor who owned a thriving practice. She had been married to a junior partner whose lifestyle was subsidized by his sister's business success. Brennan attempted to recover with questions about my personal assets and investment portfolio, apparently hoping to find some vulnerability he could exploit. But this line of questioning only revealed more evidence of my financial independence and business acumen. My personal net worth, exclusive of my stake in Morrison Orthopedic Associates, is approximately $3.2 million, I stated matter-of-factly. This includes real estate holdings in Phoenix and Sedona, investment accounts managed by Goldman Sachs, and equity stakes in 2 other healthcare-related businesses that I've helped establish over the past decade. The numbers were staggering, even to me when stated so directly. Over 18 years of building Hayes Healthcare Solutions, I had created wealth that extended far beyond my partnership with David. My success wasn't dependent on any single client or relationship. It was the result of systematic business development and strategic investment that had compounded over nearly 2 decades. But the most powerful moment of the deposition came when Brennan asked about my future plans for Morrison Orthopedic Associates. His question was clearly designed to suggest that I might somehow be planning to damage the practice or reduce David's income, but my answer revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about business partnerships. Morrison Orthopedic Associates is on track to expand to 4 locations within the next 2 years, I explained. We're negotiating partnerships with 2 regional hospital systems and developing a specialized surgery center that will serve the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. These expansions will likely triple the practice's current value within 5 years. The expansion plans were real and represented the culmination of strategic planning that had begun months before David's marriage troubles emerged. But more importantly, they demonstrated my long-term commitment to the practice's success, regardless of David's personal situation. Mr. Brennan, I continued, I think your client has fundamentally misunderstood what she's attacking. She's not just demanding half of a medical practice. She's trying to claim ownership of a healthcare business empire that she never contributed to, never understood, and apparently never even knew existed. As the deposition concluded, I watched Rachel struggle to process everything she had learned. The woman who had walked into this room believing she was entitled to half of her husband's assets was discovering that those assets were far larger than she had imagined, and that they belonged to someone who was both willing and able to fight for them. The elevator ride down to the parking garage was silent, but I could feel the shift in dynamics that had occurred during the 4-hour session. Rachel's legal team had entered this deposition believing they held all the cards. They were leaving with the realization that they had declared war on someone whose resources and expertise far exceeded anything they had prepared for. As I drove back to my office, my phone rang with a call from Tom Kellerman. Jennifer, I've been monitoring the reactions from Brennan's team, he said without preamble. They're requesting an emergency meeting to discuss settlement terms. I think it's safe to say that your deposition exceeded our most optimistic expectations for shifting the dynamics of this case. The woman who had demanded half my assets was about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who's been building an empire while you thought she was just a helpful family member. Rachel Morrison's education in the realities of business ownership was just beginning. The emergency settlement meeting took place just 3 days after my deposition, a timeline that spoke volumes about how dramatically the dynamics had shifted. Michael Brennan's office, which had previously projected confidence and control, now felt like a command center for a campaign in full retreat. The mahogany-paneled conference room that had once seemed imposing now appeared cramped and defensive, as Rachel's legal team struggled to salvage what remained of their strategy. I arrived with Tom Kellerman and Rebecca Torres, our forensic accountant, carrying briefcases filled with additional documentation that we hadn't yet been forced to reveal. The psychological effect was intentional. We wanted Rachel's team to understand that everything they had learned in the deposition was only the beginning of what they would face if this case proceeded to trial. Rachel looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by the haggard expression of someone who hadn't slept well in days. She sat rigidly beside Brennan, occasionally glancing at me with a mixture of resentment and what I could only describe as dawning respect for the scope of her miscalculation. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Brennan began, his earlier arrogance replaced by the practical tone of an attorney who recognized he was negotiating from weakness. My client is prepared to consider a significant reduction in her asset claims in exchange for a reasonable settlement that allows both parties to move forward without the costs and publicity of extended litigation. Tom leaned back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone holding all the cards. Mr. Brennan, I think you misunderstand the current situation. Your client made specific demands for half of assets that don't belong to her, based on legal theories that have no foundation in fact. We're not here to negotiate a reduction in those demands. We're here to discuss what your client is prepared to offer in exchange for our agreement not to pursue counterclaims. The reversal was complete and devastating. In less than a week, we had transformed from defendants scrambling to protect assets into plaintiffs with legitimate grounds for recovery. Rachel's systematic investigation into my business relationships, her attorney's broad discovery requests, and her public allegations of asset hiding had created legal exposure that her team was only beginning to understand. Counterclaims? Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. What counterclaims? I'm the one getting divorced. I'm the one who's entitled to community property. Rebecca Torres opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder of financial analysis that represented weeks of meticulous investigation into Rachel's own conduct during the marriage. Mrs. Morrison, your legal team's discovery requests gave us the opportunity to examine all financial transactions involving Morrison Orthopedic Associates over the past 15 years, she began. That analysis revealed some interesting patterns that your attorney might not have anticipated. The documentation Rebecca presented painted a picture of financial behavior that would be devastating to Rachel's claims of innocence and entitlement. Over the course of her marriage, Rachel had systematically extracted money from what she believed was their practice through a series of transactions that bordered on theft. Between 2018 and 2023, you made 47 withdrawals from Morrison Orthopedic's operating accounts without Dr. Morrison's knowledge or authorization. Rebecca continued, consulting her detailed analysis. These withdrawals totaled $127,000 and were used for personal expenses including vacation trips, luxury purchases, and investments in your private accounts. Each transaction had been carefully documented through bank records, credit card statements, and expense reports that Rachel had apparently forgotten about or assumed would never be scrutinized. The pattern revealed someone who viewed the practice's resources as her personal bank account, taking money whenever she wanted something without regard for the business implications or her husband's knowledge. Furthermore, Rebecca added, your systematic conversion of household allowances into private investment accounts represents a deliberate effort to hide marital assets from your husband, exactly the behavior you're accusing others of engaging in. The hypocrisy was staggering. Rachel had spent months developing legal theories about hidden assets and fraudulent business arrangements, while simultaneously concealing her own financial activities from the husband she was now trying to divorce. Her private investment portfolio, built from money David thought was being used for household expenses, represented exactly the kind of asset concealment she was accusing me of orchestrating. But the most damaging revelation involved Rachel's relationship with her interior design clients and the income she had generated without reporting it to David or including it in their joint financial planning. Your freelance design business generated approximately $280,000 in income over the past 5 years, Rebecca stated. None of this income was reported on your joint tax returns, and there's no evidence that Dr. Morrison was aware of these earnings. Tax fraud was a serious charge that could have criminal implications, and Rachel's face went pale as she realized the exposure her aggressive legal strategy had created. By demanding comprehensive financial disclosure from everyone involved in Morrison Orthopedic Associates, she had triggered an investigation that revealed her own pattern of financial deception and potential criminal conduct. Brennan attempted to minimize the significance of these discoveries, arguing that they were minor technical violations that wouldn't affect the core divorce proceedings. But Tom was prepared with legal precedents that suggested otherwise. Mr. Brennan, your client's systematic concealment of income and unauthorized appropriation of business funds constitute grounds for a complete forfeiture of community property rights under Arizona law, he explained with clinical precision. When a spouse engages in deliberate misconduct involving marital assets, the court has discretionary authority to award all community property to the innocent spouse. The legal concept was devastating to Rachel's position. Instead of being entitled to half of David's assets, her own misconduct could result in her receiving nothing from the divorce, while remaining liable for her share of any community debts or obligations. But Tom wasn't finished outlining the legal consequences of Rachel's actions. Additionally, her public allegations of asset hiding and business fraud, made without factual foundation, constitute defamation against both Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Hayes. The damage to their professional reputations could support substantial monetary damages. The defamation claims were particularly strong because Rachel's allegations had been widely publicized within Phoenix's medical community, affecting both David's patient relationships and my consulting business's reputation. Several of my clients had already expressed concerns about the negative publicity. and 2 potential new clients had postponed signing contracts until the legal situation was resolved. Finally, Tom continued, her attorney's overly broad discovery requests and unfounded legal theories have generated substantial legal costs that could be recovered as sanctions under Arizona's frivolous litigation statutes. The accumulation of legal exposure was overwhelming. What had begun as Rachel's attempt to claim half of what she thought was David's medical practice had evolved into a situation where she faced potential loss of all community property, monetary damages for defamation, recovery of legal costs, and possible criminal prosecution for tax fraud. Rachel leaned forward across the conference table, her composure finally cracking completely. "This isn't fair," she said, her voice rising with desperation. "I was married to David for 15 years. I supported his career. I managed our household. I sacrificed my own opportunities for his success. I deserve something from this marriage." Her emotional outburst revealed the fundamental disconnect between her perception of her contributions and the documented reality of her behavior. While she had indeed been married to David for 15 years, the evidence showed that she had been a passive beneficiary of his success, rather than an active contributor to it. "Mrs. Morrison," I said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time during the meeting, "you were married to David, but you were never a partner in his practice. You lived off the success that he and I built together, but you never contributed to creating that success. The lifestyle you enjoyed was subsidized by my business expertise and family discounts that saved your household millions of dollars over 15 years." The truth was harsh, but necessary. Rachel had constructed an elaborate fantasy about her role in David's career, ignoring the documented evidence of how their financial success had actually been achieved. Her delusion had led her to make legal demands that were not just unreasonable, but actively destructive to the people who had made her comfortable lifestyle possible. "The irony," I continued, "is that if you had simply asked David for a reasonable settlement based on your actual contributions to the marriage, he probably would have been generous. Instead, you chose to attack the business partnership that funded your lifestyle for 15 years. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Rachel's legal team was desperately seeking any way to minimize their client's exposure while salvaging some financial benefit from the divorce. Brennan proposed various settlement scenarios, each more modest than the last, but all of them required Rachel to acknowledge the legitimacy of my business relationships and drop all claims against my assets. The final proposal was almost insulting in its modesty. Rachel would receive David's 40% stake in their primary residence, spousal support of $3,000 per month for 3 years, and her choice of one of their 2 vehicles. In exchange, she would dismiss all claims against Morrison Orthopedic Associates, sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and formally acknowledge that my business relationships with David's practice were legitimate and properly documented. Tom and I exchanged glances before he responded. "Mr. Brennan, your client initiated this legal action by demanding half of assets worth millions of dollars, based on false allegations of asset hiding and business fraud. She's generated substantial legal costs, damaged my client's professional reputations, and created ongoing business disruption. The settlement you're proposing doesn't begin to address the damage she's caused." We left the meeting without reaching an agreement, but the psychological impact on Rachel's team was obvious. They had entered this case believing they were attacking a vulnerable family member who could be pressured into an unfavorable settlement. They were discovering that they had declared war on a sophisticated business owner who was both willing and able to fight back with overwhelming force. As we walked to the elevator, Tom smiled with the satisfaction of an attorney who had just watched an opponent's case collapse in real time. "Jennifer, I've been practicing law for 25 years, and I've rarely seen such a complete reversal of litigation dynamics. Rachel Morrison started this fight believing she held all the advantages. She's about to learn what it means to be completely outmatched. The woman who had demanded half my assets was finally beginning to understand the true cost of her miscalculation. But her education in the realities of business ownership was far from over. Mapaha. The call came on a Friday evening, 2 weeks after the disastrous settlement meeting. I was reviewing quarterly reports for Hayes Healthcare Solutions when my phone rang with David's number. His voice was strained, carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been pushed beyond their emotional limits. "Jennifer, Rachel's attorney called an hour ago," he said without preamble. "She wants to meet with us directly, No lawyers present. She's asking for what Brennan called a family conversation about finding a resolution that preserves relationships. The request was unprecedented and suggested that Rachel's legal position had deteriorated even further since our last formal meeting. Attorneys typically discourage direct communication between opposing parties, especially in contentious divorce cases where emotions ran high and statements could be used as evidence in court proceedings. "What's your instinct about this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David had always been conflict-averse, preferring negotiation and compromise to confrontation. Despite everything Rachel had put him through, he would probably see this as an opportunity to end the legal battle without completely destroying their ability to coexist in the same community. "Part of me thinks we should hear what she has to say," he admitted. Tom advised against it, said there's no strategic advantage to meeting with her directly. "But Jennifer, I've been thinking about the broader implications of this case. If we pursue every legal remedy available to us, we could destroy Rachel financially and personally. That level of destruction feels disproportionate to what she actually did." His compassion was admirable, but potentially dangerous. Rachel had spent months trying to destroy both our careers and claim assets worth millions of dollars. Her current vulnerability was the direct result of her own aggressive legal strategy and documented misconduct. Showing mercy now could be interpreted as weakness and might encourage future attempts at manipulation. But there was another consideration that David's comment had raised: the long-term impact on our professional community and family relationships. Phoenix's medical establishment was relatively small, and the ongoing legal battle was generating gossip and speculation that could affect both our reputations for years to come. Finding a way to end the conflict cleanly might be worth more than maximizing our legal victory. "If we agree to meet with her," I said carefully, "it has to be under controlled circumstances with clear boundaries about what we're willing to discuss. And David, you need to understand that this could be another manipulation attempt." Rachel's demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure tactics. We agreed to a meeting the following Tuesday at a neutral location, a private dining room at the Phoenix Country Club, where serious business discussions happened away from public attention. Tom Kellerman would be present but would remain silent unless legal issues arose that required immediate guidance. The format would allow for frank conversation while maintaining professional oversight. The intervening weekend gave me time to consider what Rachel might be planning and what outcomes would be acceptable from my perspective. The legal momentum was clearly in our favor, with potential for substantial damages and complete vindication of my business practices. But extended litigation would consume months of time and energy that could be better spent growing my consulting business and expanding Morrison Orthopedic Associates. More importantly, I needed to consider the human cost of total victory. Rachel had made serious mistakes and engaged in questionable financial conduct, but she was still David's wife of 15 years and the mother figure to several nieces and nephews in our extended family. Destroying her completely would have ramifications that extended far beyond our immediate legal dispute. Tuesday afternoon arrived with the oppressive heat that characterizes Phoenix summers, but the country club's dining room was cool and elegantly appointed with leather chairs and oil paintings of desert landscapes. Rachel arrived precisely on time, accompanied only by a leather portfolio that presumably contained whatever final offer she was prepared to make. She looked different than she had during our previous confrontations. Smaller somehow, with the brittle composure of someone who had accepted defeat but was struggling to maintain dignity in the process. Her usual designer clothing had been replaced by a simple navy dress that suggested either financial constraints or a deliberate attempt to appear less threatening. "Thank you both for agreeing to meet with me," she began, her voice carefully modulated to project reasonableness rather than the anger or desperation that had characterized our recent interactions. "I know this situation has been difficult for everyone involved, and I want to find a way to resolve it that allows us all to move forward constructively." The diplomatic language was clearly rehearsed, probably with coaching from Brennan or a professional consultant specializing in crisis communication. But beneath the careful phrasing, I could see the woman who had spent months plotting to destroy my financial security and professional reputation. "Rachel," David replied with the gentle tone he had always used when trying to de-escalate family conflicts, "we're willing to listen to what you have to say, but I need you to understand that the legal situation has changed dramatically since this started. The discovery process revealed information that none of us expected, and the implications go far beyond our divorce. She nodded, acknowledging the reality that her legal strategy had backfired spectacularly. "I understand that now," she said quietly. "I also understand that I made serious mistakes in how I approached this situation. I let my anger and hurt feelings drive decisions that were ultimately destructive to everyone involved." The admission was more honest than anything I had heard from Rachel during months of legal proceedings, but I remained skeptical about her motivations. Apologies were easy when someone's legal position had collapsed. The real test would be whether she was prepared to accept responsibility for the damage she had caused. "The question now," she continued, opening her portfolio to reveal a single sheet of paper, "is whether we can find a resolution that acknowledges my mistakes while preserving some foundation for future family relationships." The document she placed on the table was a handwritten letter, not a formal legal proposal, but what appeared to be a personal statement of accountability and proposed resolution. The gesture was clearly calculated to emphasize the personal rather than legal nature of her appeal, but it also suggested a level of desperation that formal legal documents couldn't convey. "I'm prepared to acknowledge publicly that all allegations about asset hiding and improper business arrangements were unfounded," she read from her letter. "I'm prepared to dismiss all claims against Jennifer's business assets and Morrison Orthopedic Associates. I'm prepared to accept a divorce settlement based solely on David's actual marital assets, without any claims to business properties or future earnings." The concessions were comprehensive and represented a complete surrender of everything she had demanded in her original legal filings. But her letter continued with requests that revealed she still didn't fully understand the consequences of her actions. "In exchange," she continued, "I'm asking that you agree not to pursue counterclaims for defamation or sanctions. I'm asking that the financial irregularities discovered during the investigation be treated as civil matters rather than being reported to tax authorities. And I'm asking for a divorce settlement that provides me with enough resources to rebuild my life independently." The requests revealed the depth of her legal exposure and her growing understanding of the criminal implications of her financial conduct. Tax fraud charges could result in substantial fines and potential jail time, while defamation damages could far exceed any assets she hoped to retain from the divorce. But there was something else in her proposal that suggested she still didn't grasp the fundamental dynamics of what had happened. She was asking for mercy from people she had tried to destroy, while simultaneously negotiating as if she still held some form of leverage. "Rachel," I said, speaking directly to her for the first time since the meeting began, "I need you to understand something that I don't think you've fully processed. Your legal strategy didn't just fail, it revealed a pattern of financial misconduct that could have serious criminal consequences. You're not negotiating from a position where you can make demands or set conditions." Her carefully maintained composure began to crack as the reality of her situation became unavoidable. "I know I made mistakes," she said, her voice rising slightly with stress. "But surely we can find a way to resolve this that doesn't destroy my life completely. I was married to David for 15 years. I deserve something from this relationship." The word deserve crystallized everything that was wrong with Rachel's understanding of her situation. After months of attacking my business, making false allegations about asset hiding, and demanding millions of dollars she had no legal right to claim, she still believed she was entitled to negotiate favorable terms. "What you deserve," I replied with quiet firmness, "is what the law provides for someone who engaged in systematic financial misconduct during a marriage. What you're asking for is mercy from people you tried to destroy financially and professionally." David shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly torn between his natural inclination toward forgiveness and his growing recognition of how thoroughly Rachel had betrayed their relationship. "Rachel, the unauthorized withdrawals from the practice accounts alone constitute theft," he said softly. "The unreported income from your design business represents tax fraud. These aren't minor technical violations. They're serious crimes that could result in prosecution." The weight of criminal liability was clearly something Rachel hadn't fully considered when she launched her legal assault. She had been focused on maximizing her divorce settlement without understanding that her own conduct would become subject to scrutiny in the process. "I'm prepared to make restitution for any financial irregularities," she said desperately. "I have assets that could cover the withdrawals and any tax obligations. I just need some time to liquidate investments and organize repayment. The offer of restitution was a tacit admission of guilt that would be useful if criminal charges were eventually filed. But it also represented an opportunity to resolve the situation without the continued expense and publicity of extended legal proceedings. Tom Kellerman, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up with the measured tone of an attorney who recognized a critical decision point. Mrs. Morrison, what you're proposing is essentially a global settlement that would resolve all claims and counterclaims arising from your divorce and the related business disputes. But such a settlement would require comprehensive documentation and court approval. Are you prepared to engage in that level of formal resolution? The question forced Rachel to confront the choice between accepting a negotiated settlement with substantial oversight and protections, or continuing to fight a legal battle she had already lost. Her answer would determine whether this family conflict could be resolved through compromise or would require complete legal victory for our side. As she struggled to respond, I realized that the woman who had demanded half my assets was finally beginning to understand the true cost of her miscalculation. But whether she was prepared to accept full responsibility for the damage she had caused remained to be seen. The silence in the country club dining room stretched for what felt like minutes, as Rachel struggled with Tom Kellerman's question about engaging in formal settlement procedures. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and I could see the moment when the full weight of her legal exposure finally settled on her shoulders. "I need to understand what that would involve," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I agree to a global settlement, what exactly would be required of me?" Tom opened his own portfolio and withdrew a preliminary settlement framework that we had prepared as a contingency for exactly this scenario. Complete financial disclosure of all assets, including your private investment accounts and unreported income, he began methodically. Formal acknowledgement of all unauthorized withdrawals from Morrison Orthopedic Associates, with full restitution plus interest calculated at market rates. Amendment of all tax returns for the past 5 years to include previously unreported income, with payment of all additional taxes, penalties, and interest. Each requirement represented another layer of accountability that Rachel had been avoiding through 15 years of financial manipulation. But Tom wasn't finished outlining the terms that would be necessary for any negotiated resolution. Additionally, you would need to sign a comprehensive settlement agreement that includes detailed admissions about the unfounded nature of your asset-hiding allegations, formal apologies to both Dr. Morrison and Mrs. Hayes for damage to their professional reputations, and ironclad non-disclosure provisions that prevent you from making any future public statements about their business relationships. The legal framework was designed to ensure that Rachel couldn't simply walk away from the consequences of her actions without taking full responsibility for the damage she had caused. More importantly, it would create a legal record that would protect David and me from any future attempts at manipulation or retaliation. "What about the financial settlement?" Rachel asked, her voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested she was finally beginning to understand how completely her legal position had collapsed. "Would I receive anything from the divorce beyond what I already have in my private accounts?" David looked at me with an expression that asked for guidance about how generous we could afford to be. Despite everything Rachel had put us through, his instinct was still to ensure she had enough resources to rebuild her life independently. It was a compassion that spoke well of his character, even if it sometimes worked against his own interests. "Rachel," I said carefully, "the financial settlement you receive will depend on your willingness to take full responsibility for your misconduct and make complete restitution for the damage you've caused. If you're prepared to do that honestly and comprehensively, David and I are prepared to be more generous than the law would require." The distinction was important. We weren't negotiating from weakness or fear, but from a position of complete legal superiority that allowed us to choose mercy if it seemed appropriate. Rachel would receive exactly what we decided she deserved, based on her conduct, not what she demanded based on her sense of entitlement. "I want to make this right," she said, tears finally beginning to show despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, and I know I've hurt people who didn't deserve it. I just want to find a way to move forward that allows me to rebuild my life with some dignity intact." The emotional appeal was more genuine than anything I had heard from Rachel during months of legal proceedings, but I remained cautious about her motivations. People facing serious legal consequences often discovered previously hidden reserves of remorse and accountability. Dignity has to be earned through honest acknowledgement of what you've done, I replied. It can't be negotiated or purchased through legal settlements. If you want to rebuild your life with integrity, you need to start by taking full responsibility for the choices that brought us to this point. Over the next 2 hours, we worked through the framework of a comprehensive settlement that would resolve all claims and counterclaims arising from the divorce and related business disputes. The terms were demanding but fair, requiring Rachel to acknowledge her misconduct while providing her with enough resources to establish an independent life. The financial components were structured to ensure restitution while avoiding complete financial destruction. Rachel would repay the $127,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, plus $31,000 in interest and fees. She would amend her tax returns and pay approximately $89,000 in additional taxes and penalties for her unreported income. In exchange, we would agree not to pursue criminal charges or additional civil damages. For her divorce settlement, Rachel would receive David's share of their primary residence, worth approximately $340,000 after the mortgage, one of their vehicles, and spousal support of $4,000 per month for 2 years, enough to provide financial stability while she established a legitimate business or found other employment. There's one more condition, I added as we finalized the terms. You need to understand that your relationship with Hayes Healthcare Solutions and Morrison Orthopedic Associates is permanently severed. You will have no involvement in any business decisions, no access to financial information, and no claims to future success or expansion of either entity. The boundary was necessary to prevent any future attempts at manipulation or interference with our business operations. Rachel needed to understand that her settlement provided closure, not ongoing involvement in the enterprises she had tried to claim as her own. But the most important component of the settlement was the accountability framework that would govern her future conduct. Rachel would be required to attend financial counseling to address the behavioral patterns that had led to her misconduct. She would submit to periodic audits of her personal finances for 3 years to ensure compliance with tax obligations. Most significantly, she would be required to provide written apologies to the physicians and staff at Morrison Orthopedic Associates, whose professional relationships had been damaged by her false allegations. I agree to all of these terms, Rachel said finally, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought a battle far beyond her capabilities and finally accepted defeat. I just want this to be over, so we can all move on with our lives. The legal documentation required another 6 weeks to complete, involving meetings with tax attorneys, forensic accountants, and court officials who would oversee the implementation of our settlement agreement. Throughout this process, Rachel maintained the subdued demeanor of someone who had learned a hard lesson about the consequences of overreaching. The final settlement conference took place in early November, with all parties appearing before Judge Patricia Caldwell for formal approval of our agreement. The judge reviewed the comprehensive documentation with the thoroughness of someone who understood the precedential implications of the case. This settlement represents an unusual situation where aggressive litigation tactics revealed misconduct by the plaintiff that ultimately undermined her own legal position, Judge Caldwell observed as she signed the final orders. I hope this case serves as a reminder to all parties that frivolous claims and unfounded allegations carry serious risks for those who pursue them. The judicial comment would become part of the public record, creating a legal precedent that would protect other business owners from similar attacks based on family relationships and asset-hiding theories. As we left the courthouse, David pulled me aside for a conversation we had been avoiding throughout the months of legal proceedings. Jennifer, I need to apologize for not understanding what Rachel was planning and for not protecting you from her attacks, he said with the genuine remorse of someone who felt responsible for the actions of his spouse. David, you couldn't have known what she was capable of, I replied. Rachel had been planning this assault for years, and she deliberately concealed her intentions from everyone, including you. The important thing is that our partnership survived her attempt to destroy it. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, Morrison Orthopedic Associates opened its 4th location, and Hayes Healthcare Solutions signed consulting contracts with 7 new medical practices across the Southwest. The business empire that Rachel had tried to claim as her own continued to grow and prosper, now protected by legal precedents that would make future attacks more difficult. Rachel, meanwhile, had established a small interior design practice in Tucson, far enough from Phoenix to avoid regular contact with the medical community where her legal assault had become widely known. According to Patricia Patterson, her mother, she was slowly rebuilding her life and seemed to have learned from her expensive mistakes about the consequences of entitlement and overreach. The case had generated significant attention within legal and business communities, with several law journals publishing articles about the precedents established for protecting legitimate business partnerships from frivolous divorce claims. My own profile within the healthcare consulting industry had been enhanced rather than damaged by the successful defense of my business practices. Most importantly, the experience had revealed the true strength of the business relationships I had built over 18 years. The physicians, staff members, and colleagues who had supported David and me throughout the legal battle demonstrated that my reputation was based on genuine professional accomplishments rather than family connections or financial manipulation. As I reflected on the entire experience during a quiet evening in my Sedona office, overlooking the red rocks that had inspired so many important decisions in my life, I realized that Rachel's attack had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened my position. The woman who had demanded half my assets had instead provided the opportunity to document and publicize the legitimate foundations of my business success. The final irony was that Rachel Morrison, in her attempt to claim assets she believed she deserved, had actually helped establish legal protections that would benefit legitimate business owners for years to come. Sometimes the person who tries to destroy you ends up creating the very foundations that ensure your future success. The business empire she had tried to claim as her own continued to grow, now protected by legal precedents and strengthened by the knowledge that it could withstand even the most determined attacks from those who underestimated its foundations. Rachel Morrison had learned, at considerable cost, that sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who's been building an empire while you thought she was just a helpful family member. And I had learned that the strength I had built over 18 years of entrepreneurship was more than financial. It was the unshakable foundation of legitimate success that no amount of legal manipulation could destroy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.